Hey everybody, Amer back with another Mission Impossible episode review. I just finished watching the revival, Season 1, Episode 19, which is called Bayou. This is the last episode of Season 1. So this one starts in a swamp in the Louisiana Bayou, with a girl being chased by hunters and their dogs. Finding a river, she starts to swim across, attracting the attention of alligators who she escapes. Sadly, the dogs are not quite so lucky, and she makes it to the other side, where a woman is waiting there for her, and she's not smiling. A limo pulls up, and out comes a fat, sweaty southerner in a white suit, holding a whip menacingly. The girl says she's sorry. The man says she's not sorry yet. Jim goes to a movie set and uses spy speak to get the disc player. The mission: the girl is Diane Martin, whose father is quite wealthy and has been waiting for a ransom demand, but it's now believed that she's been taken by Jacob Morgan, who is suspected of running a white slavery ring. The IMF must rescue Diane and put Morgan out of business. The IMF gets together in a New Orleans port warehouse where we see Grant practicing the trumpet in anticipation of his upcoming gig at Morgan's club called the Jambalaya Jazz, where Diane was last seen. The woman we saw earlier is Pepper Laveau, the club's manager and Morgan's fiercely loyal assistant, and we're told that the IMF will have to use some voodoo overtones to make their plans work. Morgan arrives at his club that evening and talks to Pepper in the office, as Grant watches and listens to them using special glasses. And I can't help but think a few episodes ago in The Plague, those glasses would have been super useful. But anyway, he overhears their discussion of their upcoming deal in 2 days from now. $2 million for 10 girls, apparently. Morgan spots Shannon checking herself in the two-way mirror, dressed up as a gypsy sort of type, and asks Pepper to keep an eye on both new arrivals. It turns out Shannon is a tarot card reader of some sort, takes a table. Shannon starts putting out cards, warning Pepper that there's violence and evil around her, and someone she trusts will betray her. Pepper is visibly shaken, but gets herself together and tells Shannon to get out. She does, but Grant warns Pepper that he knows firsthand that Shannon is the real deal. At Morgan's plantation, his meal is interrupted by a dapperly dressed Nicholas and his bodyguard Max. Nicholas says his name is Naxos, and he's interested in buying Morgan's merchandise, to which Morgan feigns complete ignorance, but Nicholas knows the details, including $2 million for 10, and offers $3 million instead. Morgan says he'll contact Naxos if he's interested in dealing. Jim then arrives at the club and talks to Pepper, saying he's Sam Kane, a PI from Houston, looking into Diane's disappearance. Pepper says she doesn't know anything about it, but Jim says he thinks her boss Morgan is involved in a kidnapping ring. He points out a returning Shannon, chatting with Max and Nicholas, saying that Shannon ropes the girls in and Max then takes them away. Jim offers Pepper the chance to cooperate with him in exchange for not taking the fall alongside Morgan. Pepper seems unsure of what to think at this point, as she sees Shannon chatting with Grant. Outside the club, two thugs grab Nicholas and somehow or other are able to even subdue Max for a moment so they can take Nicholas away in Morgan's limo. Jim is surprised to find a dazed Max outside the club and even more surprised to hear the news that Nicholas was abducted. Morgan and the thugs blindfold Nicholas and take him to see the merchandise. 10 sad, scared, haggard young women huddled in a small room. Nicholas is shocked for a moment, but plays his role, looking to look at Diane, who asks for help and responds that he's going to buy her. He says he'll arrange the cash and get it to Morgan tomorrow as the lights go out on the poor girls. Nicholas manages to return to the warehouse safely, and the next day comes. Pepper tells Morgan she's worried about Jim, who seems to know a lot about what's going on. Morgan says there's nothing to worry about. He's just poking around. Morgan flatly denies Jim's accusation about Shannon or having anything to do with the voodoo nonsense, but Pepper says he shouldn't be so dismissive of it. Jim's car pulls up, so Pepper leaves out the back. Morgan amicably takes Jim on a tour of the plantation, and they go to feed the hungry gators because it's that time of day. Morgan tells Jim that a gator bit off his leg when he was young, and he's been fascinated with the creatures ever since, and also warns Jim that he doesn't scare easily. Jim shows he's equally fearless and makes it clear that he's not going to stop until he gets to the bottom of Diane's abduction. The IMF makes a Morgan mask, and Nicholas calls Morgan to finalize their deal. Morgan notes the new amount in his ledger, which he puts away someplace we don't see. Jim goes back to the club and invites Pepper to a voodoo ceremony where he says Morgan will be present. Pepper doesn't believe it, but agrees to have a look for herself. The ceremony turns out to be the evil Grand Zombie, which is actually a real voodoo ritual, where Priestess Shannon turns Grant into a zombie of some sort, and Jim shows her Nicholas's Morgan standing with Max. Pepper is surprised to see the whole bunch of them there together, and is freaked out at the proceeding, running away, and it turns out to be more film trickery by the IMF. The next day, Nicholas delivers $1 million to Morgan and says the rest will be paid when the merchandise is safely on its way. Pepper interrupts a meeting, accusing Morgan of betraying her and colluding with Max and Shannon, grabbing a knife. Max subdues her, and Morgan explains to Nicholas that Pepper used to be his assistant. Max says he'll take care of her, taking her to the car, putting her in the trunk as she struggles and spits at Nicholas, telling Morgan that she'll see him burn. The trunk is rigged with knockout gas for Pepper and set up with squibs so that Max can kill her, surprising even the cold-blooded Morgan at Nicholas's ruthless methods. Max and Nicholas return with Pepper to the warehouse, with Grant snapping some pictures of her, and he discovers tunnels from the days of the Underground Railroad running through the plantation grounds, finding his way into one of them, and interestingly, they lead right into Morgan's office. Grant looks for a hidden safe or storage but finds none, sets up some voodoo paraphernalia around the office. Meanwhile, the IMF simulate a boat cabin and put Pepper in a hammock. Shannon revives her, and Nicholas tells Pepper that Morgan double-crossed him too. He has no merchandise other than the two women, so they're headed to Asia to be auctioned off. To save herself, Pepper tells Nicholas where the girls are being kept, so Jim simulates a shipwreck, and Shannon gasses Pepper unconscious again. Jim sends Shannon to the club to check the office for the records, and Grant prepares a Pepper hologram. Morgan angrily bashes away the stuff in his office and then gets a call from his man that Shannon is sneaking around the club. Morgan arrives and finds her, promising her she'll be sorry she ever came near him. Grant takes the opportunity to set up some more stuff in the office, putting blanks in Morgan's gun. Morgan brings Shannon back to his office and tells his men to go get the girls for shipment, shocked to see that the voodoo stuff has returned, and finds a picture of himself at the ceremony. At the boat, Max and Nicholas take out Morgan's thugs and free the girls. Jim puts Pepper down at the riverside near the plantation and revives her, signaling Grant that she'll figure out where she is soon and be at the plantation house in about 15 minutes. Pepper does indeed wake with a purpose, and Jim follows her from a ways back. Shannon tells Morgan that he may be possessed, angering him, and he pulls out his gun. Jim signals Shannon that Pepper is on her way, and she starts reading her voodoo chants, freaking Morgan out, and he fires at her. Shannon pretends to fall dead, but activates the hologram of Pepper with her voice from earlier, saying that she'll see Morgan burn. Now Morgan panics, running out of the house, where zombie Grant comes out of the ground to chase him. He wanders away, finding Pepper and continuing to shoot at her, which of course has no effect. He offers to give her everything, but she's not interested at all at this point. She meant what she said about him burning. She continues to advance on him. He trips and ends up becoming gator food. The police arrive to arrest Pepper, and Jim finds Morgan's records rolled up in his cane, with Jim giving us a somewhat less lame than usual one-liner. Mission accomplished. I'm going to give this episode a grade of somewhere on the border of A- and A. I had to think about it, and I had to say, is this a better episode than Reprisal from a couple of episodes ago, which I gave an A-, and you can look at that review to see why I said that. And I'm a little bit on the fence about it. I have to give it a little bit of thought. But anyway, I'm comfortable with that grade of A-, somewhere in there. Starting with the good, let's actually start with the excellent. Frank Thrain as Jacob Morgan. I remember seeing this episode back in 1989 when it first came out. I remember having it on tape, watched it several times. And and then after, as the internet kind of became a thing and I started researching some of the people who have been on the show, I looked up Frank Thring, and I found that he was actually born and lived most of his life in Australia. And I was just floored. I couldn't believe that this guy was not born and bred in Louisiana, like in Metairie County or someplace like that, just outside New Orleans, in plantation country. He is so amazingly perfect as that somewhat prototypical but effective, fat, sweaty Southerner in a white suit. Again, like I just can't believe he's not from the American South. His voice, his mannerisms, the way he walks, the way he acts is just great. What a fantastic performance by Frank Thring. Also great, Paula Kelly as Pepper LeVeaux. She is an American actress. And here, she is tremendous. She makes me believe in the Pepper LeVeaux character. And the one thing that really stood out to me about Paula Kelly in this one is her facial expressions are so excellent throughout. She shows, apprehension. She shows fear. She shows anger. She shows all of these emotions at just the right time. And they just come across from the way that she reacts and to what people are saying to her and to the things that are happening to her. And even without her dialogue, she conveys so much. She reminds me very much of Lawrence Dane from the original series, who was in 3 or 4 episodes. And I commented about him every time that he had that same skill, that he could just act so well with his facial expressions. And Paula Kelly reminds me of Lawrence Dane from the original in this one, for sure. Moving on to the actual story and the plot and what's good about it. This is a fairly classic example of what we've seen many times from Mission over the years in terms of being the separate and mislead plot, where you have two people who are working together and most of the meat and potatoes of the episode involve turning them against each other in order to achieve the goal. And I've commented a lot of times in the original series how the plot, while effective, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Where you have two people, one of them is kind of, the boss and one of them is a henchman, but the henchman is fiercely loyal to the boss. And the IMF is, through whatever mechanisms they use, able to drive a wedge between them over not a whole heck of a lot. Or they're able to do it in a ridiculously short period of time. Sometimes the IMF is able to pull it off properly and in a way that does make sense. And I think that this is definitely one of those times. The IMF is in a situation where they decide that, if we can convince Pepper LeVeaux that Morgan has double-crossed her and now she's the merchandise, that's going to set her off. And they set the foundation for it by saying, he's cutting you out. He's working with these other people. That's kind of as far as it would go in a lot of the scripts that we saw in the original series. And the henchman would just sort of, believe it. The henchman or henchwoman, in this case, would just sort of believe it and just act upon it without too much of a basis. But then the IMF takes it, they take it steps further to make Pepper actually believe that, hey, look, this is what's happening. See, they're not actively saying this, but hey, look, we told you all along that this is what's going on. So I like the way that it's sensibly done. It happens over the course of a couple of days, but with the foundation laid that the IMF laid it out, I think it makes a lot of sense here. And I like the way that the IMF went about it. It's not just kind of random the way many such plots used to be. Another thing that I liked is that the voodoo thing actually makes some sense given the setting, and the spookery around it is used properly and effectively. Compare it to the original series episode called Incarnate from season 7, which was a little rather similar in structure to this. In that episode, the voodoo stuff that they did was used somewhat haphazardly and almost randomly. Here, it's different. It's interwoven into the plot much more effectively than it was in that episode. So having, the voodoo paraphernalia show up in Morgan's office, forcing him to run, having Grant, come out of the ground and all of that stuff, that's it. And again, the key thing is that the foundation is laid from the very beginning. Where Jim says is our plan is we're going to force him to run, and he's going to take the records with him because he's not going to leave without them. So, however you feel about that idea, and I'll discuss it a little bit more later, at least from a plot standpoint, it does make sense. It's not just there to be scary. I also like here that this episode has a really good old school kind of feel. One thing that struck me right away is right after the IMF has their impromptu apartment scene, they get a scene where the two baddies, Morgan and Laveau, are discussing their upcoming plan and what they intend to have happen. That's exactly the way some of the best IMF plots played out. We have that scene where the villains are kind of metaphorically just rubbing their hands in glee that okay, we got this, and this is what's going to happen. The plot plays out in a way that is very similar to a lot of well-structured original episodes from the first few seasons. And again, I feel that in so many ways here. But just that one scene establishing that that's how we're going to run this episode really stood out to me. Also, the villains here are quite engaging. There's no lameness or schmuckery, really. The IMF do quite the number on these two. It's definitely an earned win. But these villains avoid the kisses of death, in my opinion. You could say that there is some lameness on the part of Mr. Morgan, but I think it's forgivable because of Frank Thring's tremendous performance. A note that I wanted to throw out there, Danielle Spencer, who plays Diane Martin in this episode, I did not realize this, but she actually ended up meeting Russell Crowe right around this time. And eventually, they were married for 15 years. They're divorced now, but she is the mother of Russell Crowe's children. Who would have guessed? I just randomly looked that up, and it's like, wow, I had no clue. Anyway, moving on to what is not so great. This episode does have some lame dialogue amongst the IMF. That's just a given. That's just the way the scripts are written. And yes, you can say that this episode is kind of hokey overall with some of the imagery that they have and that sort of thing. But I think it's okay. Again, it overcomes a lot of that just with the performances of the villains. And speaking of the villains, yes, there is a Disney villain death at the end of the episode where Morgan falls into his own, gator swamp. But it's completely cathartic. And again, I feel like I'm repeating myself. There is a foundation laid for it with that scene of Morgan and Jim and him talking about, what gator bit off my leg and I'm not afraid and all of this kind of stuff. And Morgan kind of sets the tone for that ending. So it's not as just kind of out there and just like, oh, random, as many of the other Disney villain deaths we've seen have been. Another thing that is not so great is that there are some pretty blatant plot contrivances here. It starts out one of the I'll tell you some of the more noticeable ones to me. When Nicholas is meeting to give Morgan his deposit payment, Pepper shows up just at that time, which seems kind of weird to me. How is it that she showed up just then? It might have made more sense for Jim to tell her that, hey, something's going down back at the plantation or whatever, because Jim talks to her the previous evening, and then suddenly the next morning she shows up just like that, just at the right time. Also, it's contrived where the tunnel that Grant finds leads right into Morgan's office. It's a bit of a shame because it laid some foundation, as I've mentioned, for a lot of things, which is really, really good. But this could be a simple thing that they could have laid a foundation for. It might have made sense. All the IMF had to do is make an offhand comment about how, yeah, Morgan kept that there because it's an escape tunnel, for his house in case of emergencies. Or maybe it's part of the system that he uses in order to squirrel the kidnapped girls away when they're brought to his house or whatever, and that's how they end up getting taken to wherever they're getting. I think they could have woven that in. It would have been just so simple to have a line or two of dialogue about that, but it just didn't happen. It's also weird, I mentioned this before, about how Jim makes a special point of talking about how Morgan is going to have to keep the records on him when he ran. I sort of get it, because it's really his only evidence, in a sense, of the fact that he has this $3 million deal with Nicholas, and maybe there's other pending deals or whatever that are on his charts, or what have you. But again, it's a little bit of interesting contrivance that earlier we see Morgan kind of roll up the papers, which is a little bit of a hint if you think back and say, oh yeah, he's rolling them up to put him in his cane. And then we have the reveal at the end where Jim finds him in his cane. It's a good thing he didn't just put the papers in his pocket or whatever and have them be eaten by the gators. So, again, this is the ending that the writers wanted to have. And there is some contrivance there. But again, I do feel that the great performances of Paula Kelly and Frank Drake overcome that. Speaking of which, in terms of callbacks, I've already mentioned the episode Incarnate from season 7. In that episode, Incarnate, the voodoo trickery, as I think I said, is used kind of as a crutch because there's not as much in the episode. There is a little bit of that here, but as I've already mentioned, it's mixed in with the plot. And part of the whole voodoo trickery is the fact that part of the IMF plan is to have Pepper come back from the dead. So, it fits in with all of that and actually enhances that plot point rather than just, being orthogonal to it or just a random thing. So I think it fits much better here rather than being shoehorned into the Incarnate episode and other episodes where the IMF utilized spookery. I will also say, I was looking for another episode where the villain's performance makes up for a lot of plot contrivances and other weirdness that goes on. The one that I thought of, and there may be others, but the one that stands out to me from the original series is from season 5 called The Cataflack. And in that one, we had John Vernon as the main target of the IMF. And I mentioned in the review for that episode that John Vernon, who's, was always tremendous when he was on the show, he single-handedly made it a great watchable episode despite all the contrivances and some plot holes. And I think that a callback is deserved to that episode from here because our two antagonists definitely fit that bill. And I think that's about it for this one. So we're done with season 1 of the revival, moving on to season 2, which has a lot of interesting things in it. Like most seasons of Mission Impossible, I've referred to almost every season as a little bit of a mixed bag. There's some good ones, there are some not so good. It was the same deal here in season 1 of the revival. It'll be the same deal in season 2 of the revival as well. But a lot of them are definitely entertaining, and all of them are certainly worth discussing. So I am very much looking forward to that. Thank you guys, as always, for watching. Please like this episode review. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And please leave your comments about this episode and other episodes. Still looking forward to more comments about whether the look and feel. I've already got some comments saying that, people appreciate the fact that now with my new camera and setup and things like that, I'm at eye level and that sort of thing. I really, really appreciate that kind of feedback because I don't even realize it. I didn't even realize that was a good thing and that thing that I had not been doing. So please keep that feedback coming. It's really, really valuable to me. Thank you again, and I will see you next time.